I'm Susanna Bleakley. I'm the Chief Executive of Morecambe Bay Partnership. Morecambe Bay Partnership is a small charity. We work all around the Bay, from Barrow to Fleetwood. We created the Bay Cycleway. We're busy delivering work in lots of different areas: arts, archaeology, birds, beach cleans, collecting memories and stories, and opening up the countryside for disabled access. The Bay has a wealth of history, but much of it is not appreciated. We as a team absolutely love what we do, celebrating and conserving the nature and the heritage. We love to share the magic of Morecambe Bay, and that's really what these Sunset Series talks are all about. With our curlews returning to the nesting sites, we're restarting our community work to protect their nests. Later in the spring, we've got training for volunteers to learn coastal archaeology survey skills, to identify footprints from the past and help us build up a picture of how prehistoric people used the bay. If you want to keep in touch with all the work that we do, if you want to learn more about us, you can follow our work on social media, you can sign up to our e-newsletter, and again, you'll find a link in the chat. And anybody who's interested in volunteering with us, just get in touch through the Facebook, through the chat, or through our website. It gives me very great pleasure to introduce Bill Shannon this evening. Bill is an old friend of the partnership. He is a trustee who joined us last year. He's a popular speaker and hugely knowledgeable about local history, about early modern maps, and about landscape history. He is terrifically learned. He's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, and he has a doctorate from Lancaster University. He is also a thoroughly good egg and a delightful gentleman, and I'm so pleased to introduce Bill to talk. Just one last reminder, please, if you have questions, if you can type them into the chat. And so now I'm handing over to Bill.
Well, thank you for that introduction. How the Bay got its name. If you'd have asked me a few years ago why the Bay is called Morecambe Bay, I suppose I would have said, well, it's always been called that. Or perhaps I would have said, well, it's called after the town, in the same way I say Cardigan Bay is called after Cardigan. But in fact, this map is the first time the name appears on any map. It's a map that was made to accompany Father Thomas West's book on the antiquities of Furness, which was first published in 1774. And at that date, of course, the town of Morecambe didn't exist. Now, Thomas West was a Jesuit. He was based at Tytop Hall near Dalton in Furness. And he obviously had time on his hands because, as well as his great book on the antiquities of Furness, he also wrote one of the earliest guidebooks for the lakes. And this is a map from that book, which originally came out in 1778. It was an enormous success. My copy is the 6th edition, 20 years later. But if you have a look at the rather strangely oriented map of the lakes in that book, you'll see it doesn't mention Morecambe Bay at all. What it does is focus on the over sands crossings, which were becoming quite a tourist attraction at this date, over Lancaster Sands and over the Leven and Ulverston Sands. Incidentally, he doesn't mark many places, but there he marks tight up there just by Dalton, which is his home. Now, this map, published a few years earlier in 1752, similarly doesn't mention Morecambe Bay, but it does mention the Cartmel Wharfs. And this one, going back 100 years previously, this is the first county map of Lancashire, Christopher Saxton's map of 1577, and it has Kent Sand and it has Leven Sand. But it doesn't have Morecambe Bay. What it does do is emphasize the cross sands routes here. You've got Conishead Passage there, and you've got Cart Lane Passage going up into Cartmel from Hess Bankside. So where did that name come, Morecambe Bay, that Thomas West used? Well, to answer that, you have to go back to this man, Claudius Ptolemy of Alexandria, he was alive in the first half of the 1st century. The illustration here isn't contemporary, it's an imaginative reconstruction dating from the 16th century, but it shows him in his role as mathematician and astronomer. But he was also a geographer. In fact, he was one of the first people to use that term geography, meaning to write about the earth, as opposed to cosmography, which is to write about the heavens. And in AD 150, he wrote a book called the Geographia. which probably didn't contain any maps, but it gave detailed instructions on how to make a map of the Earth, showing how to convert the globe of the Earth into a flat map. Now, as an aside, like every other educated man in antiquity, and indeed right through the Middle Ages, Ptolemy knew perfectly well that the Earth was a globe, it wasn't flat. And his book gave instructions on how to do a projection, as I say, to convert, to make a map of the whole of the inhabited world. But because he actually gives us grid references for 8,000 places, it's far too many to put onto one map. So he also gives instructions for making 26 regional maps, as well as his world map. Now, his book was written in Greek. No copy of the original survives. The oldest Greek manuscript dates from the 13th century, but it was lost to the West. Copies were preserved, fortunately, in the Arab world and slowly started to emerge back into the West in the Middle Ages, with Latin translations appearing from the 15th century and the first printed copies with maps appearing towards the end of that century. Now, the text from on the right here, on the left here, is from a manuscript copy dating from about 1460. And I'll just draw your attention to this bit here, which refers to the British island of Albion, and it refers to the town of London. And it says, it describes the latitude and longitude of London. It says the longest day has 17 hours of sunlight, and it's distant from Alexandria to the west by 2 hours and 2/3 of an hour. So that allows you to fix it in space north of the equator and west of Alexandria. Now, this is a world map on Ptolemy's projection. This is from one of the earliest printed editions, that of Ulm of 1482. It misses out a little over a third of the globe, the bit around the back between Spain and China, which, as far as Ptolemy was concerned, was empty, because of course he didn't know that America occupied part of that empty space. And he also doesn't include the bottom third, because that was Terra Australis. This was the southern land, the uninhabited and unknown parts of the world. Now, here is one of his regional maps. This is his map of his own home country of Egypt. His hometown of Alexandria is up there, and near it is the island of Pharos, which is the famous lighthouse of Alexandria. Then you come down the Nile. Here is Heliopolis, which is where present-day Cairo stands, and you come down through Thebes and down to Elephantine Isle and Philae, which is where the Aswan Dam is these days, and then you're out of Egypt and into Ethiopia. Here's another of his regional maps. This one is Taprobana, which is present-day Sri Lanka. Now, he got it a little bit wrong because he has the equator running through Taprobana, which of course it doesn't do. But at the opposite end of the known world was the island of Britain. This is again from the Ulm edition of 1482. And note this strange S shape. I think you'll agree that England and Wales, Cornwall is pretty accurately done, but Scotland for some reason has got canted over to the right, and that appears to be an error in transcribing the latitudes and longitudes. We'll come back to that later. You'll also notice that Ireland here is too far north, and the Isle of Man is off the southeast corner of Ireland rather than sort of halfway up. So, if you now have a closer look at Britain on this map, there's the Isle of Man again, you'll see that down this west coast, there is a place marked as Morikambe Estus. Now, this is a Latin map. It isn't the original Greek. So Morikambe Estus should translate as the Morecambe Estuary. So where does that name come from? Well, essentially, it comes from Ptolemy. It comes from this map first made something like 1,870 years ago. But where exactly is it? And is it our Morecambe Bay that he's talking about? Now, it's worth remembering the only information Ptolemy gives us is a grid reference. So he gives us its latitude and its longitude, with a whole pile of other places. He didn't leave us any maps himself. Now, it might be a bit clearer on this, where I've transliterated the Greek and given the latitudes and longitudes. So here we have Morikambe Ice, which I've translated as Morecambe tidal flats. I'll come back into that in a minute. It's 17 degrees 30. Now, this is using a slightly different method. Instead of being west of Alexandria, on this map, he's using east of the Canaries as his sort of base. And he also says that the latitude is 58 degrees north. Well, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. That would probably put it somewhere up near the Outer Hebrides. So we've got to take this with a certain amount of pinch of salt. What we do know is that it's south of a place called Ituna, and it's north of somewhere called Setantion Limen, the harbour of the Setanti. So we'll be looking more at those two places in a minute to try and identify where this place is. Now, Ptolemy uses the word ischousis, which makes his first appearance in his books. And it seems to have been coined by him to translate a Latin word formed by two Greek words, meaning from ice, meaning into, and kousis, meaning pouring in. And I think he had in mind something like Now, that, of course, the tidal bore at Arnside. You can see the railway viaduct there. I photographed that last October on a rare day out between lockdowns. And it's something I've seen many times, and I hope many of the people in the audience will have done. But it's something that Ptolemy could never possibly have seen. The tides in the Mediterranean are measured in centimetres, not the 10-metre tides that we get in the bay. So his description, an ischousis, of flooding in, I think really is his attempt to explain something that he had never seen, but had been described to him. So we translate it as estuary, but it really is much stronger word than estuary. You can see how impressed those Roman soldiers would have been by a site like that. Now, this is Cornelius Tacitus's book on the Agricola, his account of the conquest of the northern part of Britain. And he talks about Agricola starting his campaigns, choosing sites for camps and reconnoitering estuaries and forests. So here's this word estuaria, which in Latin, as in Greek, means a place where the waters rush in. And later in the work, when he's addressing his troops on the eve of the great battle in Scotland, he talks about the long road we've traveled, the forests we've threaded our way through, the estuaries we have crossed, all redound to our credit, transisse estuaria. So here's Tacitus writing about Agricola and talking about something that had clearly impacted very strongly on their minds as to something that was particularly British about this campaign. Now, Ptolemy, who's getting his information from Agricola, uses this word ischousis, which I've translated as tidal flats, a dozen times or so around Britain. And it's interesting to just compare that with Agricola's campaign. Now, one wonders how many of these oversands crossings, perhaps, that Agricola and his men made during that campaign in 79 AD, when they were moving up through Lancashire into southern Scotland. Did they actually cross Morecambe Bay? Did they actually cross the Solway over sands in that year? And was that what they were reminiscing about when he talked to his troops on the eve of the Battle of Mons Gropius? Well, let's go back to what we know from Ptolemy. First, there's the name of the place. Now, Ptolemy got the name from Agricola's soldiers. Agricola's soldiers would have got it from the British people in the area. The Welsh word for sea is still more, and the word for a bend, a curve, is cambo. So Morikambe is a curve of the sea. In other words, a bay. So actually, that means that Morecambe Bay just means the Bay. Next, we know that this word ischousis means a flooding in. It's referring to the tidal flats. It's referring possibly to the over sands routes rather than estuary just in the sense of a mouth of the river. Now, there are no location details in what Ptolemy gives us. We merely have to guess from what we've got. But we know that we've got Ituna, and we know as we come down through these places, sorry, Ituna is the Eden. We're definite about that. We can fix that. And we come right down here to the Ganganon promontory, and that is the Llyn Peninsula. So what we're saying is the Morecambe tidal flats lay somewhere between the Eden and North Wales. And that's really all that we can get in terms of data. If we look at it on the map itself, there it is. What we can see here is that it is located in the land of the Brigantes. Now, this is this tribe whose headquarters were at Albury in Yorkshire and whose territory extended from sea to sea. Now, that's the information that we've got. Using that information, the great 16th century antiquary, William Camden, was in no doubt where Morikambe was. It's just south of the Solway, right up here. And to this day, the estuary of the Wampool and Waver is marked on the Ordnance survey maps as Morikambe. So are they right and are we wrong? Now, this man, Abraham Ortels, who translated in Latin as Ortelius, from Antwerp, the greatest mapmaker of his day, he tried to solve the problem of where all these classical places were. And he began in 1570 this incredible project to map everywhere known from the classical world and to put it all onto modern maps. And in this supplement called the Parergon, which began small with a map of the whole Roman Empire, a map of ancient Greece, and a map of the journeys of St. Paul, it gradually expanded until there were 49 historical maps, one of which was this two-sheet map of Roman Britain. And on this map, here's a slightly later edition with west at the top, he marked the Morecambe River, Morikambe Flumen, which would roughly appear to be the River Kent. So he didn't locate it up here where our friend Camden did. He put it down here, but he thought of it as a river, the River Kent. Now, English antiquaries and antiquarians still continued to locate it up here. Here's a map of 1695, and it's still being put up there rather than down there. But then in 1732, along came John Horsley, the great historian of Roman Britain, and he didn't mess about. He said Morecambe Estuary must be that in the north part of Lancashire into which the rivers from Kendal and Ambleside empty themselves. So no messing about. That's where it was. Now, incidentally, he used this word estuary. Now, we didn't have a word for estuary in English until it first appeared in an English work in 1538 when it was used by the antiquary John Leyland to translate those Latin books. So he was using a Latin word to translate a Latin word, basically. And it's only later that it comes to take on this meaning of just a river mouth. Now, around about, shortly after, Horsley then put the Morecambe estuary roughly where we would say Morecambe Bay is today. And there's the Eden estuary up there, Morecambe estuary, and Setantiorum Portus, the port of the Setanti. Now, a little bit later than this, a map of Roman Britain appeared, which had been made by Cirencester in 1338. And it was a copy by him of a Roman map, and it was made available to William Stukely, who published it. Now, this showed quite clearly the Morecambe River between the Derwent and the Lune. Great.
Wow.
Unfortunately, this map turned out to be a forgery. It was a forgery by a brilliant young Englishman called Charles Bertram, who was living in Denmark. He was only 23 when he sent this map to Stukely. It completely fooled Stukely. It fooled everyone for years. It was well into the 19th century before it was proved to be a forgery, despite it being full of anachronisms. You'll notice this range of mountains down here is called the Pennines. Well, that was a much later name given to that area. But be that as it may, its presence, the presence of Morecambe River on this map helped opinion to come down in favour of saying Ptolemy's Morecambe must be the Kent and Leven and Lancaster sands. And John Whitaker in 1771, he was in no doubt about Richard, native of Cirencester, monk of Westminster, author of many historical and theological pieces, that the work is genuine needs no proof. He wasn't messing around. All the embodied antiquarians of the 14th and succeeding centuries could not have forged so learned a detail of Roman antiquities. Well, he was wrong about that, but it allowed him to say in a footnote, thus the immediately succeeding estuary of Morecambe in Ptolemy, which means the great bend or haven, must certainly be the large opening into the land of Lancashire, which is formed by the shores of Lancaster, Cartmel, Ulverston and Walney Island, and into which the rivers Ken and Lune discharge their waters, as this is the only great bend before we come to the estuary of Ituna, which is clearly the mouth of the Eden. So there we have it. No messing about. We know exactly where it is. And then our friend Thomas West, who we started with, says, thus Dr. Whitaker has cut the Gordian knot. Thus we have ascertained the Bay of Morecambe, which he then put on his map, adding those words to an English map, if you like, for the first time. Now, note, incidentally, that he spelt it with an E. Everybody else prior to this had always spelt it Morikambe Bay, but there he is, he's spelling it with an E. Now, soon after that, the first ever 1 mile to the inch county map of Lancashire was published by William Yates. And this is a modern map. This is for modern travellers, etc. It's not intended for antiquarian study and so on and so forth. It's a modern map, but on that map, Yates put the Bay of Morecambe. And that name then entered the mainstream and it stuck. Here it is on Greenwood's map of 1818, Bay of Morecambe. Here it is on Hennet's map of 1829, Bay of Morecambe. Although he's still hedging his bets he's still got Cartmel Wharfs written down there and Lancaster Sands and so on. And you notice too, the continued emphasis on the over sands routes as being a very important means of transport, a means of crossing around the place. So we then have the first edition Ordnance Survey, which was surveyed in between 1844 and 1848, and that also puts Morecambe Bay right where we would expect to find it now. Still got Lancaster Sands, still got Cartmel Sands, etc. But the whole thing is now called Morecambe Bay on, if you like, the official map. And if we look closely at the 6-inch of 1846, showing where the town of Morecambe now is, you'll see the town of Morecambe did not exist at that time. What existed was Poulton the Sands, Poulton by the Sands. But already by this date, 1 or 2 people were starting to, if you like, trade on this antiquarian association. So we've got there the Morecambe refreshment rooms. We've got over here Morecambe Terrace. We've got here the Morecambe Hotel, which is in Lord Street. And I believe a hotel has recently reopened using that name in that location. And then in 1846, a new railway was opened with a station there and a line running out to a jetty there. And it called itself the Morecambe Bay Harbour and Railway Company. And that really put the seal of beginning to call this whole area here Morecambe. It grew up as a sea bathing resort, growing up around this railway terminus here. And as mill workers on their wake creeks, etc., started to come in, the place grew and grew. And by 1889, the place decided to change its name from Poulton, Bear and Torrisholme to Morecambe. So Morecambe came into existence in 1889, 100 years after, 100 years and more after the name Morecambe Bay had first appeared on the map. So quite clearly, Morecambe is named after the bay, not the other way around. Now, so basically, in summary to that, the town takes its name from the bay takes its name from a consensus of 18th century antiquaries about where a 2nd century Greek geographer who'd never left Alexandria located some tidal flats which he'd heard about, probably in a military report dating back to the time of Agricola, it was about 84 AD. But were they right? Were those antiquaries right in locating it there? Well, yes, probably, but the reality is, who knows? But the name has stuck, and now for 300 years or so, we've had Morecambe Bay and Morecambe. Now, I'd like to say something more about this other site, the next site down. We've got the Atuna, Eden, we've got Morecambe Bay, and we've got this other site, Sitantion-Limen. And this has been every bit as contentious over the years as to the location of Morecambe Bay. It's the harbour of the Sitanti. And if you Google it, using the Latin name, perhaps Portus Sitantiorum, you'll see it's a Romano-British seaport near Fleetwood, it says here. And if you go to the classic work on place names of Roman Britain, Rivet and Smith, they say, from its position on Ptolemy's map, probably a harbour at or near Fleetwood at the mouth of the River Wyre. Now, the problem is this is the only reference in classical antiquity to this place, and there's no evidence. So when in the 1940s, a pebble bank appeared off Fleetwood, everybody was convinced that they had discovered the Roman port of the Sitanti. But in fact, there's no evidence at all that this pebble bank was man-made, let alone that it was Roman-made. But as I said, the game of hunt the place has been played as long and as hard as it has been for Morecambe. And here's Camden deciding that actually the accounts have got it wrong, and it isn't the Latin word for haven, limen, but the Latin word, the Greek word for a mere, limna, not limen. And so he decides that actually that the Portus Sitantiorum is Windermere, which is where he locates it. He locates it actually as Windermere and running down the Leven into the bay. Now, Ortelius once again rejected Camden's ideas, and instead of locating it where he puts it into, he calls Morecambe, what we call Morecambe Bay, as the Sitantiorum Portus, as you can see there. Now, if it might be just worth mentioning too that Horsley, who got Morecambe Bay right, he had to locate Sitantiorum Portus somewhere else, so he located it off the Ribble. So he decided that it was actually the Ribble was the port of the Sitanti. But he got one or two other places wrong. I mean, this is this is knowledge progressing. He called Ribchester Coccium, which we now know to be Wigan, whereas we know that Ribchester is Bremerton Arkham up here. So a number of the places have to be shuffled around as the evidence comes along. And until we've got inscriptions in situ, we're always guessing as to where these places are. But if we're looking for evidence about where this harbour of the Sitanti was, then how many harbours are there in Ptolemy's Britain? There's the Sitantion-Limen, the harbour of the Sitanti, which is the one we're talking about. And then on the south coast, there are two others, the Megas-Limen, the great harbour, and the Kainos-Limen, the new harbour, which is Dover. The great harbour is the Solent. And on the east coast, there is one other place, which is Gabrantovices Gulf, suitable for a harbour, Limen Koltos, not currently a harbour, and that's probably Bridlington Bay. So basically what we're saying is that in the whole of Roman Britain, there were 3 places named as harbours or havens, and 2 of them are pretty famous. Now, this is Hengistbury Head and Christchurch Harbour. This is the great harbour going around there to the Solent. And you can see here how good a harbour that is, natural harbour. You've got also the sandy beach here where you can beach ships up and so on and so forth. And perhaps not surprisingly, this became a hugely important pre-Roman Iron Age trading site. And this is some of the archaeology on that headland, and you can see how this area in particular, sort of into the harbour area, becomes the main trading area through the Iron Age and into the Roman period. So wouldn't you perhaps expect to find something similar at Setante-on-Limon? Now, I won't ask you to read all this, but just to sort of summarize, we've got 3 harbours. We've got the New Haven, which is the newly established Roman port of Dover. It becomes one of the main bases of the fleet. We've got the Great Haven, which is a major pre-Roman Iron Age trading place, trading with the Mediterranean, bringing in wines and luxury goods in exchange for metals, possibly with the Isle of Wight acting as a tin depot. And then on the west coast, we've got Setante-on-Limon. And I think it sort of stands to reason that it must have been a similar pre-Roman Iron Age depot, again, trading with the Mediterranean, albeit on a smaller scale, in which case we'd expect to find similar sort of archaeology. So where on the west coast have we got the right sort of archaeology? And the answer is at Mells, on the tip of the Wirral Peninsula in Cheshire. Over the 19th and 20th century, large numbers of finds were made, including finds from as early as the 3rd century BC, Carthaginian coins, Gaulish coins, pre-invasion Roman coins, belt fittings, brooches, etc., etc. And it goes on being a major trading post right through the Roman and post-Roman periods. And there are more of some types of Viking finds on the tip of the Wirral Peninsula than there are in York. These are just some of the Roman brooches that have been found at the site, for example. And all the 19th and 20th century finds were drawn together about 10 years ago into this catalogue by Robert Philpott and others, which really shows what an important site this was, what an important pre-Roman trading site this was. Now, the site itself is near Hoylake, present-day Hoylake. The word Mells means sand dunes in Old Norse, not descriptive sort of name. Now, it looks like the sand banks off the coast here have changed quite a lot in the last couple of 100 years, because if we look at a map of 1693, you can see how it was back into antiquity. There was this major sheltered inlet, 7 fathoms deep, the Hoyle Lake, sheltered by the Hoyle Sand from the weather to the north and west. So allowing ships to anchor up here and trade along the coast here. And if we look at this conjectural reconstruction of what it looked like 2,000 years ago, here's the sandbanks, here's the ships sheltering, and here's the beach, the beach market that people were trading at. Now, so who were the Setante? Now, it's not known. The only reference to them is in Ptolemy, but Rive and Smith reckon the name is related to a Gaulish wayfarer goddess. The name seems to mean a wayfarer, and they say the name is related to the river Satyr, which they identify with the Mersey. Now, I think they were a small tribe. They controlled this beach market at Mells. They were exporting salt from Cheshire, metal from North Wales, and bringing in luxury goods from around the Mediterranean. They were probably a small sept within the large Brigantian Federation. Now, as we said before, Ptolemy shows the Brigantes here. Here's the Setante-on-Limon, the Brigantes here. But interestingly, opposite, on the other side of the Irish Sea, there are also Brigantes. And it may be that this group were trading across the Irish Sea province. And it may be the purest coincidence, but we're talking about the Setante, and the great Irish legendary hero, Cuchulainn, his childhood name was Setanta. it's pronounced in Irish Shadanda, but it's the same. It seems to be the same word, Setanti, as the Setanti of this side of the Irish Sea. And in fact, if you read the stories which were translated 100 years or so ago by Lady Gregory, you see one of the stories tells how Setanta spent part of his youth over on this side of the Irish Sea in Albion. Now, we don't know exactly where, but who knows, maybe in this sort of area. But getting back to our map, how do we square what I've been saying with the fact that Ptolemy has the Setanti, the port of the Setanti up here, and the tidal flats of Setia down here on either side of the Belisama, which is the River Ribble, which is a bit confusing. Now, my guess, and it is only a guess, is that Ptolemy was using two different sources. He had information which probably dated from the 50s or 60s AD, showing places around the west coast going round to this haven, this port of Setanti. But he then had a second lot of information which derived from Agricola's campaigns, and particularly derived from the fact that in AD 84, after the Battle of Mons Gropius, Agricola ordered his fleet to circumnavigate Britain, to sail around anti-clockwise and survey the place as they went. And you'll see, particularly interestingly, I think, his focus as the fleet comes around the promontory, tidal flats, tidal flats, tidal flats, tidal flats, tidal flats. It seems that they were particularly interested in those that particular feature, which may have starred, if that's not the wrong word, in the invasion of the north by Agricola and his troops. It may have registered particularly as something that was advantageous to the army. They could cross them on over sand routes, but perhaps dangerous to the navy, because there was always the risk that if you weren't careful, ships could be left high and dry miles from the sea as the tide went out. So I'm saying he's trying to reconcile two different lots of survey data with a third lot of data which referred to the inland places. And it may be that he just made a mistake. I mean, here at Vinovion, which is right up on the coast, or the west coast here, that's actually in County Durham, right over here. It's a misreading of a grid reference. And then there's this place, Rigodunon, and that means the royal fort. But where it is, no one knows. It's, again, more guesses about that than almost anywhere. Is it Ribchester? No. Is it Lancaster? No. Is it Castle Shore, as Rivian Smith said? Well, probably not. Is it Ingleborough? Definitely not. Is it Kirkham? Well, maybe. Who knows? But that's another story. Anyway, if you'd like to read any more about any of this, there is a paper which I published a few years back. You can download it for free from the Cumberland and Westmoreland Antiquarian and Archaeological Society. Thank you all for your attention.
Well, Bill, that was terrific. Thank you so much. What a lot of detective work was going in there. And I think we're all just got our heads spinning trying to keep up with it all. Now, let me see if I've understood this correctly, Bill. You've told us that the town takes its name from the bay. The bay takes its name from some sort of consensus of maybe 18th century antiquaries who were wondering where this second estuary was, that some Greek geographer who, Ptolemy, had he ever left Alexandria? I don't know. He had located some tidal flats somewhere, and he got this from a military report from AD 40 something, I don't know, 84 AD. It's an extraordinary story. So it really is a really, really exciting story. I think everybody is telling us how much they've enjoyed this talk in the chat. We'll certainly be really keen to try and answer some questions, but I do hope everybody's been able to sort of keep up with the detective work. We had my goodness, we had forged maps, we had considerable uncertainty about what was what and where was where. A really terrific story, and for many of us, I think we just hadn't appreciated that the name Morecambe Bay was not commonly accepted. We have a chart in our office, in the meeting room in the office, which we have searched and never found the name Morecambe Bay on it. It talks about Lancaster Sands and Cartmel Wharf and so forth. And now the explanation is coming clear to us. So that was terrific. I think first of all, I would like to thank you most sincerely, because we've had all sorts of comments. Fascinating. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Absolutely great. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Wonderful research. So well presented. What a ride rate. So overwhelming enjoyment and praise, Bill, for your talk. It's particularly interesting for me because the very first time that I met Bill Shannon was maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and he sort of bounded up to me with a book and said, "Look, I've got this record of the first map with Morecambe Bay on." And at the time, I also didn't really fully understand how exciting it was. So it's kind of lovely that one of the first things you said to me was, "I know the story of Morecambe Bay." So that's really, really terrific. We have got some rather specific questions. I'm just scrolling through them. And there's one here from Andy Fear, who is asking, do we know why the railway company picked Morecambe as the name to use?
I think, I mean, remember, it's 1846. The name had by then become established on the 3 main county maps. So it was on Yates's map, it was on Hennett's map, and sorry, I'm forgetting my way, but Greenwood's map. So it was on those, but it didn't appear anywhere on, if you like, the ground surface. And I think that it was a pure marketing, a pure piece of brilliant marketing. They called themselves after this name that was now appearing on maps. Yeah. And I think it's the same as the people who built the Morecambe refreshment rooms. I think, this is a way of attracting tourists. It's got a backstory here that's worth exploring. So
there was another question about the word, and I hesitate to pronounce it, Bill. EULIMEN.
Yes.
Suggesting, does it just not mean good harbour?
Yes, it does, but it's the word after that, which is the word suitable. Right. So what it's saying, the Gabrantovices is suitable as a good harbour. It's not a harbour yet. And it's thought to be Bridlington Bay, where the Roman surveyors, the naval surveyors, have said, we can use this place.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you touched on this, the question of Morikambe, meaning perhaps crooked sea, or a curve of the sea, or a bay. Yeah. And there is a question about this saying, what about it being more for Welsh for sea and can be Latin for curve?
Yeah, I mean, the people in the past have taken that first element as meaning either more the Welsh word for a sea, or more vor, the Welsh word for great. And now I think it's the word for sea, as in, the Breton Armorica and so on and so forth. So I think it is, the word is sea. And then but the word sea is the adjective, and it's qualifying whatever it is. So it's the sea something. It's and the best bet is that it's a British word, something like cambo, meaning a bend, a curve, or whatever. So it's the curve of the sea. But I mean, the Latin word is not dissimilar to the British word because they're all Indo-European languages and so on. So I mean, I am not a linguist, I've forgotten the right word, but you know what I mean, a philologist or whatever, I have to take what other people say here. And generally speaking, it's been interpreted as either the Great Bend or the bend in the sea. And I tend to go for the latter.
Yeah.
Anyway, I like the idea of it meaning the Bay. It's one of those words like, you know, Pendle Hill means hill in 3 languages.
Yes, and all those maps in Africa where the hills are just called Big Hill or Medium Hill or Small Hill in the native language.
That's right. So I think
back
it's one of those. But I mean, again, it's interesting because what it clearly shows is that those soldiers going up through the country, through Lancashire to Cumbria into Scotland, or the sailors coming back in the other direction, were asking people what the names of these places were. Yeah. They were asking the native names. They were doing exactly the same as the explorers in Africa were doing. Yeah. And sometimes they no doubt got as stupid responses as to, you know, what do you mean, what's it called? It's a big bay, for God's sake, you know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you talked about the curve of the bay, because I mentioned before that we created the Bay Cycleway. Yes. And the symbol that has been used for the Bay Cycleway, the symbol that in fact has been adapted as Morecambe Bay's destination brand, was in fact inspired by the curve of the bay. So the circle with the squiggles in. The brand designers who created this symbol, which some of you may see on some sort of publicity and marketing material, this was sort of inspired by this concept of the curve of the bay.
Yes. So yeah, you're absolutely right, even though you didn't know it at the time. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Well, no, it was built over. It was built upon the knowledge that.
I just spotted somebody put a question up asking, saying, would the Romans have been shocked about the tidal range? And I mean, I think absolutely. You know, if you live in the Mediterranean, you're used to a few centimeters. Now, okay, we all know that the officers were largely Roman, the soldiers were not necessarily, and they would have had those experiences. But when Julius Caesar landed on the Kent coast, he hauled his ships up, and they were then wrecked because he hadn't allowed for the tides. So the Romans learned the hard way, but even there, the difference between the tides off the Kent coast and our 10-meter tides are vast. Now, there is a Roman account of out in towards the Baltic, where they say it's something like a 40-meter tide, which is absolutely not possible. But, you know, again, so you're starting to get travelers' tales that are exaggerating and building on these stories. But yes, they would most definitely have been shocked and surprised, but then also appreciated the benefits. Here is a major river, which, you know, there isn't a bridging point. Fording it, you'd have to go right up high to ford it, or you can wait till low tide and walk across. It's 8 miles, you know? Yeah.
And there is a question from Bill Stevens saying Ptolemy famously turned North Britain sideways, resulting in coordinates for places like Trimontian, which is clearly near Melrose in the Tweed Valley at the head of the Solway.
Yes.
Would this be part of the explanation for the mislocating of Morikambe?
Yes. I mean, again, we've got, you know, one of the problems. Greek numbers are even worse than Latin numbers because they're based on Greek letters, and that the chance of miscopying them over 1,000-year period is extremely high, and so there are definitely misunderstandings of grid references and so on and so forth. And some of it may be that. Balancing against that, because the places are listed in order, then it's likely that the next place is, you know, sort of south and reasonably close, either east or west, and the place after. So there is a little bit of self-correction. What happened with the turning of Scotland? Again, there are theories about this as to exactly what happened. Was we trying to piece together 2 different maps? Is it a misreading of the latitudes and longitudes that by as turning 1 through 90 degrees? I don't know. I mean, there are whole books published on this subject. So, yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's like, again, I said before, you know, Britain, Morecambe is located at 50 degrees north, which 58 degrees north, which puts it right up by the Orkneys, or the Outer Hebrides rather. You know, so, but, you know, hey, we're talking about 150 AD. It's incredible. You know, look how accurate that map really is of England, Wales, Cornwall, etc. Ireland, the Isle of Man. It is incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a related question from Colin. Graham Robb, in his book, The Debatable Land, suggests that the ways in which Ptolemy's maps were compiled from surveys with differing grid systems, and hence the confusion about the place names. What do you think about those ideas? To some extent, that's very much related to what you've just been saying.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's absolutely right. I think it was possibly Rive and Smith who initially talk about the problems of trying to reconcile data coming from different and irreconcilable sources. That, you know, so he's got, for the interior parts of Britain, he's got at least 2 different accounts. The accounts would seem to be direction and distance. So it's the sort of thing that says the distance from Chester to Manchester is so many miles, and it's roughly east. You know, so he's trying to reconcile that type of itinerary type, not mapped information, and that's being passed down to him from different sources with the same sort of information. Those the sailors that circumnavigated, they weren't mapping. They would have been making notes of the promontories and how far it was to the next place and how far it was, using, you know, the sailing by method. So, you know, it isn't going to be incredibly accurate. But yeah, I mean, I've got that book on the debatable lands on my bookshelf behind me. Yeah, and I agree. Yes.
And taking a slightly different tack, a couple of people asking, where is the nearest Roman road to Morecambe?
Well, the person you need to ask that is David Ratledge, who has been doing an enormous amount of work using LiDAR, which is throwing a lot of our ideas out of the window. In particular, he has shown that the road that runs from Preston to Lancaster doesn't follow the line of the A6 beyond Garstang, but in fact veers off to the west towards Cockersands and runs up the coast there. And it may be that that was actually looking at an oversands crossing. And I think you may find the same thing as you head further north, that almost certainly, I mean, we've seen in those quotations from Agricola, the Romans were not stupid. They were using oversands crossings, but of course you're not actually building a road. The other one that's recently turned up, a new road in southwest Lancashire, which appears to be heading straight for, oh gosh, what's it called? But it's another place called Hest, which again looks like it's a fording point low down, fording the River Ribble across towards Kirkham. So again, you'll never find a Roman road, but you've got hints that the Romans were using these crossings.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you. We've got a question about the monasteries, and are there any documentary sources from early monasteries which might have helped, or monasteries owning lands in the area which might have been exploiting the resources?
We have some very good information, particularly about Furness Abbey, of course, with the cartulary there. But I mean, none of them mention Morecambe Bay for obvious reasons. You know, they've never come across that name. They do, of course, I mean, famously, prior to the Reformation, the monks are responsible for providing the guides over sands. Conishead has, you know, the guides. Cartmel looked after the guides. Furness itself. So I'm spending an awful lot of my time at the moment working in a group of historians researching a 14th century map called the Goth map. And one of the notable things about that is the way it seems to show a great deal of interest in oversands routes, and each of them is sort of located by a monastery. As you go up the coast, there's a monastery, you know, as on each of those estuaries, each of those oversands routes. So I think there's a very close association between those ways. I mean, think a couple of years ago, you know, the Morecambe, what's it called? The Morecambe Gateway,
Yeah.
the new road. There was a superb excavation done there by Oxford Archaeology North at a grange belonging to Furness Abbey at Beaumont. Now, quite clearly, the way you got from Furness to Beaumont wasn't the long way around. You know, you would have come across the sands to get there. So I think there would have been a long history of the monks using these routes across the bay.
Once again, Bill, there's so many comments in the chat about how much people have enjoyed this. It's quite clear to me that several people will be going to the YouTube channel and will be listening to your talk again. We'll be pausing it, trying to make sense of it, absorbing it. And I think it's going to become one of the all-time favourite talks, because it is just such a fascinating story. And I find it extraordinary that the wealth of history and stories that there are around the Bay, but so many of them not well known, not appreciated, which again, brings me to this point that it's so special for us to be able to share these stories with a wide audience, to be able to record them and put the stories into the YouTube so that people can go and enjoy them again. And just once again, a reminder that if people would like to help this work, would like to help more people, young and old, to share the excitement of learning these stories and hearing these stories, we would so appreciate it if you are able to make a donation and to share that excitement with more people. Our final thanks to Bill, and most of all, our thanks to every one of you for joining us.